Yes, and here we go. Charles Moscowitz. Thanks for joining me, everyone. Monday through Friday, 3 to 4 p.m. Eastern Standard Time is my habit here to do the live stream on all subscribing stations. And then, of course, the download is on numerous podcasts, which are listed on the website, which is charlesmoskowitz.com. My guest is John Klezak. He is master in English. He's taught college rhetoric, research augmentation for over 7 years. He is the author of many articles, and his book is called School World Order, the Technocratic Globalization of Corporatized Education. John, thanks for joining me today.
Thanks for having me back, Charles. How you been?
Pretty good, plugging in here. As best we can in these times of semi-censorship, I should say. I mean, I'm still doing the show and I'm grateful. And Rumble is the flagship station. I'm supposed to be on Roku soon, so that'll be a development. But I was kicked off YouTube mainly because I mentioned some information about the COVID virus that I had read off of a government website. It's been pointed out to me that we're not supposed to read government websites. Those are only for government people, I guess. So it wasn't like I was disseminating, quote, disinformation. Of course, the other thing I got in trouble for was a political matter, which is questioning the outcome of the 2020 election. So I feel I want to continue with that conversation. In fact, on Thursday, I've got Captain Seth Keshel coming on, who's one of the leaders in that ongoing research. But John, you're an educator. You have written a book which talks about, drawing from the work of the late Charlotte Iserbyt, whom I've interviewed in the past, and her revelations about the agenda of our public school education. And I think you're tying it into some of the ways in which our public schools have used the COVID virus as an excuse to further their agenda. So let's first start off with a bit of a thumbnail on your research and your theory of education. What's happened to it?
Yeah, so my book, you can basically break it down into two broader sections. One has to do with basically the corporatization of education. That's largely through public-private partnerships, such as through charter schools, voucher programs, also community school wraparound services. And then along with that comes basically the replacement of academics with workforce training. And then the second component is basically how technology is used to facilitate that. So I pretty much look at three sequential and broad categories of technologies that are sort of on a scale. So the first being adaptive learning technology, which is basically a modern version of B.F. Skinner's teaching machines. Then there's biofeedback wearables that are used for what's called social emotional learning. So they're data mining the students' emotions. And then a third category, which is sort of still in the making, and that's called precision education. And that is where they data mine the students' genetic algorithms, particularly IQ algorithms or the sequences that would purport the students' IQ scores. And then from there, I also look at the development of brain-computer interfaces, such as Neuralink, to be used to interface the students with AI and to facilitate social credit.
And that's the brain chip that's being developed by Elon Musk, who I admire for having freed Twitter, by the way. And suddenly, after 5 years of being frozen, my Twitter account is booming. But we have major issues with the brain chips. But I want to, before we go there, John, I want to just go into a little background of what they're trying to do here. You talked about drawing from Charlotte Iserbyt's work. I've interviewed her in the past. My good friend, Dr. Samuel Blumenfeld, the late Sam Blumenfeld, was a regular friend of mine, a regular guest of mine and friend and mentor. And he noted that there's kind of a collusion between, I guess you'd say, the left and the right back in the 1920s or even earlier. Whereas on the right, you had the big corporations, the Rockefellers, the Carnegies, who wanted to create a docile workforce that would punch a time clock. Back then in the 1930s, you had major manufacturing where you'd have 5,000 people show up to work. You didn't want to have too much thinking going on, too much dissent. You wanted to have people emotionally conditioned in a way that they could handle long, boring hours of work. And so they developed the concept of human resources, and they wanted to invest in the schools. And then on the left, you have the so-called frontier thinkers, headed up by who is called the father of progressive education, John Dewey, who sat at the foot of Stalin and who was a leftist, and who wanted to create a socialistic man. They removed the idea of developing the sovereign thinking individual and create this sort of collective beehive. So they both had common interests. They were both sort of weirdly working toward the same thing, right?
Yeah. And Dewey himself was funded by Rockefeller. And then he started the Lincoln School out in Columbia University, and Columbia University was also a big hotbed for where a lot of the early iterations of what would become the Skinner method developed. And those largely started with somebody called E.L. Thorndike, and he came up with these puzzle box experiments that would later become Skinner's his Skinner box experiments. And you can actually trace both of these traditions of psychological conditioning back to Leipzig, Germany. And actually, it was Thorndike's, the guy who hired him at Columbia, that was James McKeen Cattell. He was one of the first people to get a PhD from Wilhelm Wundt. And then it was actually G. Stanley Hall, who was the first American to get a PhD from Wundt. And it was G. Stanley Hall, who was a mentor to John Dewey. John Dewey was also one of the founding members of the American Federation of Teachers, the AFT, which is it's the second largest teachers union in the United States. And Samuel Blumenfeld wrote quite a bit about not just the AFT, but the NEA as well, the National Education Association, which is itself the largest teachers union in the United States. And I believe it's the largest union period in the United States. And what you saw there early on was sort of another version of what you allude to with this sort of collusion between left and right. And that is that the NEA was largely focused on, in its early development, more on what at the time, nowadays we think of it as critical theory as it sort of evolved, but back then they had other names for it. It was largely the same idea, and one of them was called values clarification. It came out of Sidney Simon's curriculum. Charlotte wrote a lot about it. I believe Blumenfeld wrote about it as well. Mm-hmm. So they were more, and the NEA was more into sort of the social engineering, the cultural engineering. But the AFT, which was headed by Albert Shanker, he's actually the guy that came up with the concept of the charter school, of public-private partnership. And with the AFT was formed as basically modeled as a trade union as opposed to a professional union, which the NEA was modeled after. So it was the AFT that largely pushed for a lot of the workforce training. And, now today, both of these unions are underneath the umbrella of a global union that partners with the World Economic Forum. And the global union is called Education International. So at this point, basically the right and the left, the workforce training and the social cultural engineering have sort of been merged together and globalized through this global union that partners with the World Economic Forum, which is pushing its great reset for this fourth industrial revolution.
So the first, in a sense, the first social experiment that they engaged in was the removal of phonics as the methodology of reading, and Sam Blumenfeld wrote a lot about that. English is a phonetic language. The way you learn a phonetic language is by sounding out the vowels and consonants to then have a reflex, what Sam called a phonetic reflex, that you can then form words and sentences. And it's a logical way to think. Chinese is not a phonetic, alphabet. It's a hieroglyphic alphabet. So that's how they do it. But in English, it is phonetic. The English word is not a hieroglyphic, but they tried to turn it into a hieroglyphic with the use of, let's say, reading the Dick and Jane series and the flashcards. And the result is they were trying to get children to learn to view words as pictures. as opposed to words. And the result was, according to Rudolf Fleisch, who I think was a Harvard educated professor, and many other researchers, it created dissonance and dyslexia and a lot of other social ills because children became, young adults who were virtually illiterate. They could read, but it was in a very, it didn't get there in the right path, which helps you think. And this was everything. There's everything to do with John Dewey, who implemented that system, and who wanted to, turn the classroom into like a psychological lab as opposed to something where you could actually learn how to think cognitively. So I think that was the beginning of what you're talking about, John. That was the launching point. And then, of course, they got into the Skinner theory. He was big in the 1970s and still is. Wasn't he the author of The Greening of America, I think, or was it? I mean, that was someone else. But he basically put his own son in a box for a year or something and deprived her.
Yeah, as a daughter. Yeah.
And deprived her of like basic normal interaction. And I think that, I don't know how she ended up, but this was kind of an experiment to try to figure out the best way to create this new human being, this new man.
Yeah, well, Skinner, he's got a book that's called Beyond Freedom and Dignity, which sort of captures his idea of human nature and consciousness itself, right? And so for him, basically all of consciousness and all of human behavior is nothing more than a mechanistic reflex to environmental stimuli. So the idea of freedom and dignity are, to him, basically archaic sort of superstitions, right? Like there's no self, there's no you. That inner monologue that you have is not a conscious entity. It's just the noise that your neurons fire and make when you respond to certain stimuli. So for him, there is no bad student, right? Or there's no bad citizen, right? There's only bad stimuli, and what you could characterize a student or a citizen as in terms of good or bad is only determined based on how good or bad the stimuli is. So for him, basically, you could make a utopia, and he had a book called Walden 2, which was sort of his fictional idea of a utopia, that you could create a utopia if you basically engineered society in a way where there was enough environmental stimuli to sort of corral and herd people into their proper social roles. And if you just think about social credit today, if you've ever seen how it works over there in China, I mean, it's basically a system of rewards and punishments, which is basically Skinner's operant conditioning method. He just had 4 quadrants, so positive, negative punishment, positive, negative reward. The positive and negative has to do with whether or not you're removing or adding a stimuli, and then the punishment or the reward is to reinforce or to deter. So basically, you just hook up through the Internet of Things, a series of facial recognition cameras, various other applications, algorithms, and monitors, whether they be on your devices at home or whatever other devices you use at work, aggregate all that data, and then incentivize people to, be politically correct by basically restricting their access to the public square commercial services, or to maybe reward them. Like I've read that you can cut in front of the line at the doctor's office if you have a really high social score. If you have a really low social score, in another realm, transportation, for instance, you can't get on the high-speed rail, which is pretty much the only way to travel in most of the country. So, by basically tracking and tracing everything everybody does, whether it's online or in, real space in real time, they can basically set out these institutional rewards and punishments, and hopefully their goal is to create, a utopia, which is basically just a very high-tech form of what Skinner had envisioned.
Right, and of course, the utopian vision has nothing to do with God or with morality. It's an earthly dictatorship, a turning of the world into an international ant colony. Now, you're talking about the manifestation of this agenda that was put forth by Dewey and by the Rockefellers back in the 30s to create this new kind of human being, this dumbed down person. And you're adding the element of technology here. And I think that what you're describing is very much what's happening in communist China. I heard George Gilder talk about this in an interview. He's an intellectual. He spent several years in China, fluent in Mandarin. I think he was an ambassador under Bush. But he kind of knew, he reported on what was going on there. And he talked about this. I remember hearing him years ago, and I'm like, oh, that could never happen here, But it is. And he said it was going to. And I'm like, wow. And he said that they have credit scores and they have the technology where they can track every person, probably I think through cell phones or through something else. And if you don't have a high enough number, you don't get to eat. Then you don't get to leave your community. You're like, you're almost like in the state of a concentration camp over there. But if you get a high number and you're a member of the Communist Party, you live high. I mean, you get everything. You're exempt. It's a whole different set of rules. And I think that it's safe to say that they are trying to implement that in this country. And to a certain extent, they already have with regard to corporations. If a there are three, you mentioned three criterion that are part of this social score. And again, the danger here, putting aside the venality of doing this at all, is that this is online, this is digitized, this is something that is tracked. And the corporation has to have so-called social justice, unquote, just a euphemism for communism. It has to have environmental justice. And then there's a third thing, I forget, I don't know, what is the third piece?
It's the governance. It's ESG, environmental, social, and governance. The governance largely has to do with Klaus Schwab's idea of stakeholder capitalism. So it has to do with, do you include enough community, state, global, and national stakeholders in your business decisions, basically.
Right, and when a corporation doesn't adhere to these three principles, and they're very arbitrary and vague, and they don't have a high enough score, then they get punished. They can have, you can lose your ability to get loans, you could lose your ability to, get publicity, all these different things. And I think that this showed itself, in my opinion. I don't know this, but right after the 2020 election, the sovereign citizens of the state of Georgia, through their state legislature, tried to create some remedies for what they viewed as ballot fraud and election fraud. That there were certain practices in Georgia, like stuffing ballot boxes and keeping names on the rolls that of people who had died or had moved out of state, and there were other things that happened there. And it is constitutionally their obligation and right as a state legislature to make those laws. So they did. They went ahead and they passed several laws to try to bring back voter integrity in that state and bring back the principle of one man, one vote. And the result was that Coca-Cola, which is headquartered in Atlanta, suddenly decided to boycott that state, and that the All-Star game, the National Baseball League, decided that they would not do the game in Atlanta that year when they were supposed to. They did it in another state. Now, I think that had to do, and this is just my opinion, I think that had to do with this social score. I think that they ran afoul of this leftist internationalist thing, which said, oh, you're not adhering to what we think is proper governance in your state, so we're going to punish you. And the corporation said, we're going to punish you. Right?
I think there's several angles at which that system is slowly sort of trying to wiggle its way over here in iterations, right? I mean, so that could be one. A couple of examples that come to my mind are just the whole concept of being canceled or deplatformed.
Yes.
Okay. The other one has to do with, whether or not you're up to date on your jab passport. Okay, and all of the various, right, the jobs that people have been fired from for not being up to date on that.
People in the military were being dishonorably discharged, and they weren't even allowed to resign if they didn't get this experimental vaccine. And I think that we can thank the Canadian truckers for putting a stop to that, at least for now. They were being told they had to have this jab, and I think that the passport, they couldn't drive the truck, and of course they were moving very quickly to the electronic passport, which is what you're talking about, under the skin, and the truckers said no, and they stood up and they blocked the highways of Canada, and they brought the economy almost to a halt because they run everything. And it was spreading around the world. Australia, New Zealand, France, even Israel, they were starting to pay attention. And I think that the internationalists backed down because they realized that they had to give in. I mean, of course, they tried to frame them, and you had Klaus Schwab's kindergarten head of the government there, Trudeau, say, "Oh, you guys have something against black people, or you're racist, or something like you're Nazis." When most of these truckers are men of color in Canada, so obviously that was false. And they backed down. And just to give a local example, here in Boston, where I live, the new mayor of Boston, Michelle Wu, she had just signed a decree saying that anybody entering any business in the city of Boston, a restaurant, a store, they had to show their ID, or you couldn't go in. Nobody paid attention to that. Even liberals, didn't do it. But after the truckers, she quietly pulled that away. She retired that. So I think had it not been for the truckers, they were moving forward in breakneck speed to make sure that everybody had these, papers, and that those papers were going to turn into chips.
Yeah, well, I mean, so that, they had the Excelsior passport in New York, which is an IBM product that runs on blockchain. And so that's basically the end game, or at least what is instrumental and integral to the social credit system is some form of digital ID, right? And, the globalists, right? The Rockefeller Foundation, MasterCard, Accenture, Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, Global Alliance for Vaccines and Immunizations, they've all been part of something called ID 2020 since 2018. So, I mean, there's been a global push for this digital ID, but the digital ID, just like the social credit, can be sort of can be ushered in from various different angles, and they all sort of overlap together. And so one of them is first the vaccine passport, right? So having to carry your health records on some blockchain digital device, because the blockchain is going to be an exhaustive ledger of every transaction that is categorized within there. So one is the healthcare. The next another will be digital currency. So basically transitioning from the popularization of private cryptos to a CBDC, a central bank digital currency. And then another one that I see on the horizon could be digital ID for internet usage. And I speculate that some of the issues with the number of bots on social media, that at some point somebody might propose that the way to deal with that will be to have a digital ID on the internet, so that we can authenticate all these accounts, so that we know there's not any Russian bots or whatever types of bots. And then another recent development that could also help push in the idea of digital ID is this recent development with the deep fakes. So it's been going around on the internet that they've got this app. I think Musk did a little interview where he used this AI app, and he was using different voices. I think he could sound like Morgan Freeman, he could sound like Joe Biden, he could sound so, they will at some point say something to the effect of like, maybe it'll probably be something like a stock market issue, right? So maybe somebody uses an app, they sound like Joe Biden saying something about that impacts the economy in some way. Investors move their money, right? There's a big glitch in the stock market, and then it will be, we've got to get digital ID because it's too easy for people to realistically fake being people of political or corporate power. So, but you need that digital ID to basically aggregate all of the data that the social credit system pulls from your various devices and from the Internet of Things. I mean, right now, right, through various big databases, I mean, they have all the analytics, but it's distributed in ways that makes that perhaps they might miss certain algorithms to properly score you. So the idea is that if you have one digital ID on a blockchain ledger that integrates with all your devices and the Internet of Things, that's the best way to precisely condition people through a social credit system.
I mean, look, they just finished, I think they just wrapped up the meeting in Davos where they really were very open about all of everything you're saying, including the digitization of all currency. We won't have cash anymore. So everything you do will be going into a gigantic brain somewhere. And that they can shut you down if they don't like you. I mean, I'm no big fan of Nick Fuentes, but he has his right to his opinion. He's a private citizen, had his bank account seized, all the money taken out. He can't get on a plane. His name is put on a no-fly list, so he has to travel by car. And now they're putting in, a rumor has it, I think it's more than rumor, that by 2030, the cars are all going to have a kill switch. Who's going to be handling that? I'm just saying, I mean, these are all things that seem to go to what you're saying. I mean, PayPal shutting people down because they don't like their political opinions. There's nothing to do with anything real in terms of threatening to be violent. And so, yeah, I mean, what you're talking about is the gradual but creeping hermetical sealing of the entire planet under the hands of these same illuminated elites, whatever you want to call them, these demons, who have been around in every generation, in my opinion, since Adam and Eve, except now they've got more advanced technologies and they've got more persuasive means through control of the means of communication.
Yeah, I mean, and, you could see the sort of it's not just by osmosis that that these social credits policies and systems are sort of floating over here to the United States. But if you look at the board of trustees of BlackRock, of World Economic Forum, one of them is Larry Fink, who is the head of BlackRock.
I did put BlackRock in that category. Larry Fink. Talk about using political clout to force people and companies to be woke, as they call it. I mean, I think that it's Governor DeSantis of Florida just said, we're going to pull our pension funds out of the BlackRock system. And something that came about from that was the realization that the state of Florida, which is probably a pension system, must be worth like $10 billion. That's a drop in the bucket compared to the amount of money that they control. Anyway, go.
No, I mean, I was just going to add too that, but BlackRock is also invested in the Alibaba Group, which runs the Alipay system, and it's the Alipay system through Ant Financial that runs the Sesame Credit social credit system in China. And another financer of that system is Salesforce. And the head of Salesforce, Mark Benioff, is a trustee at the World Economic Forum. So two of the trustees are invested in two of the American companies that are financing the Chinese social credit system. In other words, for a very long time, I mean, you can go back to the very first Rockefeller Foundation annual report, I think 1913 and 1914. Right? And I've spent time looking through all of them up to 1950 when I did a large amount of research on their financing of eugenics. And it always popped out to me. One of the first things that I noticed in that first annual report was that the Rockefeller Foundation had financed the Chinese public health system. I mean, so since basically, I mean, China's entire technocracy has been built up by our corporatists, starting with the robber barons, right? So, I mean, I think it's always been sort of used as a pilot sort of beta test area to sort of try out various totalitarian political techniques and various other oppressive technologies, and then to sort of usher them back in over here.
There's many kind of wings to this bird. I mean, it's sort of like the Manhattan Project during World War II, the way the US government developed the atom bomb. You had one group doing something in New Mexico and in Alamogordo. You had this other group in Tennessee that was doing one thing. There's a group up in Washington State. There's a group at the University of Chicago. And nobody knew what the other group was doing, or even that they even existed. And yet there was a couple of people at the top who knew everything. And I think that kind of that structure is how they run this whole thing now. You know, you've got different pieces. You've got the financial piece, you've got the propaganda piece, you've got the psychological piece, you've got all of these different moving parts, each of it its own sovereign entity, each doing its own thing and not necessarily knowing what the other's doing. And I think you've got a lot of people at the lower levels of this thing who are completely unwitting and unconscious in terms of what they're doing. I mean, you and I know people like this. They don't know why they believe what they do, but they follow, you know, Lester Holt every day at 6 o'clock news, and that's what they learn and that's what they take in, and it's kind of like a psychological conditioning. I mean, it's an obvious example. They despise Donald Trump, not for reasons that they can explain. Yeah, we can take issue with a lot of things about Trump. I mean, obviously. I mean, I don't like the fact that he pushed that vaccine, but the point is that their rationale and their hatred for him is not rational. It's like they have a computer chip implanted in the back of their brain, and it's something triggers. And I've seen this phenomenon more and more among people that are reasonable, assumedly reasonable people.
Well, a lot of it has to do with, propaganda works mainly, so I teach rhetoric, right? And, there's three major rhetorical appeals, okay? It's logos, ethos, pathos, right? So appeal to logic, trust, and then emotion. So propaganda almost always, right? It basically minimizes the logos or the logic, and it emphasizes, right, the pathos and the ethos. So the idea here is that your worldview is based on how you feel about people that you trust. In other words, established authorities. I just remember, one of those commercials for the jab, and it was nothing. The whole commercial was just doctors or actors dressed like doctors in lab coats, and it's basically they just repeat, "Trust us, trust us, trust us, mm-hmm. Trust us." Right, and so the idea here is that you validate your worldview and you judge your social status based on the degree to which you conform with the accepted authorities, and the accepted authorities are basically spoon-fed to you through various propaganda, whether it be in media or through the education system. And so they do this thing by sort of associative, by association, right? So you just take Trump and then you associate, white supremacy, racism, homophobia, right? All of the buzzwords that, right, the left bristles at. And what happens is if anybody exhibits or can be suggested to exhibit one of those categories, they therefore fall into all of those categories, right? Right. And so, like you said, there's plenty to critique Trump on, and I've done it pretty extensively. But that sort of emotional, irrational, sort of partisan-based response to him is always responding to the things that really are not the main issue that you could critique him on that would be substantive, Well,
yeah, I mean, it's a perfect example of how far they've come in their control over the means of propaganda. I mean, they studied, MK Ultra studied how to manipulate people's emotions on a mass level, and I think that the obvious example of bringing that up to a high art was the Nazi movement. They did these things where people would, the nighttime, rallies with they were the smells and the incense and the blaring music, the Wagner, and they'd march in and they would have this incredible emotional performance where people would be deprived of different functions for that time, and they would almost suspend reality. And women were fainting. I mean, it was. And then of course I think they all study how Hitler did this. It was brilliant. He'd get up there and he would almost speak in a whisper. It was like, oh, it was very faint, and it was like James Brown when they threw the cape over him, and he'd get up and I mean he's cool. I mean I've always admired him, but I'm bringing it up because then he would gradually build and then slowly move up, and then the voice would get a little bit. And by the end of the speech, of course, arms are flailing and screaming and yelling, and everybody's like, their heads are like blowing up. And it was very studied. And I think that world leaders have studied this. And I think that after the war, you had MK Ultra in the United States, you had the Tavistock Institute in England, you had the Soviets had their Polytech group. And these people studied this and they developed it into a fine art, how to brainwash the masses, how to control, mass manipulate people's minds through the use of emotional tools.
Yeah, and one of the ways to effectively create or to generate propaganda is, not just to strategically implement those appeals, but you need a narrative, right? And in any narrative, right, there's characters, there's conflict, and there's resolution. And so, what Trump provides is sort of the foil to all of the agendas that they want, right? So he basically is the boogeyman if they want you so scared of Trump that you'll go along with anything the other side that is in opposition to Trump goes along with, meaning the Great Reset, right? Meaning all of these various technocratic policies. But, you got to wonder, is Trump there just to be, right, just to polarize? Like, is he there just to basically galvanize people in that way? I mean, certainly, I think him remaining in the political discourse gives the Democrats, gives Biden more cover, right? Because they don't have to actually defend what they do as much as they can just say, well, you don't want Trump, do you? So in some ways, I wonder what the greater role that he's playing is.
Well, yeah, there is a possibility. I mean, I know I get where you're coming from, and you may be right. I mean, we don't know. I tend to think that Trump really is who he is. I mean, I think that he's an independent businessman. If you read his books going back to The Art of the Deal, and I've followed Trump for many years, he's quirky, but he's independent. I mean, he has his own way of thinking and his own way of doing. And he doesn't play ball with this establishment. Neither did John F. Kennedy, by the way. All right. Need I say more? The point is that, he did come along and throw a fly in the ointment. I mean, they were moving forward with this whole internationalist movement. And I think that Trump woke people up. And that's why they despise him and fear him. And the movement that he represents is something that they need to destroy. And this is what, it's pretty scary in a way. The lengths by which they might go to do that.
Yeah. I mean, it's just like when you looked at the whole, the warp speed thing and the lockdowns and some of that, and he's still very proud of it, right? I mean, so
Trump, he has his flaws, and they study the flaws of people like Trump, and his biggest flaw is his overinflated ego that he seems to. He was played like a fiddle by Fauci and Birx. Should never have listened to them. They despise Trump. And there's this new book out actually by this Dr. Alexander, I forget his first name, published by the same publishing house that published Bobby Kennedy's book on Fauci. And he said he was in the room there with Fauci and Birx. He was part of that team, and they kind of confided in him. He says mainly because he's black, and he has a Jamaican accent, so they figured he was one of them, a Trump hater. And of course, he was not particularly political. He's an immunologist, but he writes that they were just trying to take out Trump, and that they tried to push him into doing the lockdowns by using praise and, oh, you're going to be brilliant, and you're going to stop this thing for the world, and they use the same tactics to get him to push the vaccine. You'll be the first. It'll be beautiful. It'll be the greatest. So yeah, that's his weaknesses, and then we won't play them.
Yeah, does that particular author does he get into it all as to what the reasoning was why Trump didn't hire Bobby Kennedy Jr. to be either secretary of HHS or head of FDA, right? I mean, he was there at one point, and
I don't know anything about that, but I mean, but he got Trump, once they got Trump to agree to the lockdown, which was supposed to only be for a few weeks, they had him by the short and hairies. I mean, at that point, he was in. And, then of course they demonized legitimate medical modalities that could have stopped the whole virus, like hydroxychloroquine and other things, which is the mere mention of that got you banned. I mean, the whole thing is so genocidal. The fact that they would try to do this, not just to stop Trump, but as a social experiment to manipulate, get people to be in fear to the point where they would surrender their freedom to such an extent that nobody even would think possible. I mean, you think about what was going on at that time. I mean, it's obviously a social experiment, and Klaus Schwab released a book basically outlining it before it happened, right? Fauci announced it was going to happen right after Trump won the election. We're going to be having, quote, a surprise, he said. In video, you can still see this. I've probably been banished. There's going to be a medical surprise in the next year or two, he tells us. What is he talking about? I mean, he's talking about the pandemic, basically.
Yeah, what's interesting is, I helped Michael Rechtenwald write this book. Well, I helped him do the research.
Yes, good man. I had him on my show. Great guy.
Yeah, and one of the things that we dug into was basically the Malthusian history behind the sustainable development movement. And if you look at the Limits to Growth document published by the Club of Rome, 1972, that was put together by a team of MIT scientists, and one of them in particular was J.W. Forrester. And this is a guy that, sort of came up with some of the early computer models for, sort of how population growth, resource consumption would over time escalate to this Malthusian catastrophe. And it's funny to note that the year he used another simulation called the World One computer. And he said that by 2020 would be the year that you would start to see everything sort of collapse. And this was in the 70s, right? Mm-hmm. So I mean, it's very interesting that year pops up, going all the way back to the people that generated the Limits to Growth data. So I don't think it was just like Event 201 or even Fauci and Bill Gates sort of hinting here and there leading up. I wonder, if they've always sort of had this round about this time to be an inflection point for this to get us to Agenda 2030, which is also this. It's not just the same year that the UN wants us to basically reach a certain level of sustainable development. It's also the same year that people like Ray Kurzweil suggest that the singularity will occur. It's either between 2030 and 2040, depending on who you talk to, whether it's Kurzweil or I forget the Russian guy's name that was part of the Russia 2045 project. But so I think these dates are, yeah.
That's his deal. I mean, I interviewed somebody from Kurzweil's organization here in Boston years ago, and the guy was almost like a cult. He's the glassy eyes. I mean, it was like he was hypnotized or something. And I think that Kurzweil is a brilliant guy. He invented the talking book for Stevie Wonder. Great, a brilliant man. But then he goes off the deep end with this business about evolving a new kind of a man that would combine biological and computer components, and that these computer components would regulate all aspects of your body and give you your health to the degree that you could live to be at 200. It sounds like the Ubermensch, right? You live to be 200, you have perfect health, super strong, blue eyes and blonde hair, you look perfect. And he's serious about it. And he says he doesn't believe in God, but he says we're going to have a God. We're going to invent God, basically. Harari in Israel is the same way. Anyway, What's the deal?
Well, it's very much, I mean, it's, it's transhumanism is itself, it's the second iteration of eugenics. It was Julian Huxley that coined the term in New Bottles of New Wine, published in 1958 or 1959. This was a guy who was the first director general of UNESCO. He was also the president of the British Eugenics Society. But then there's also very much a Gnostic element, a Hermetic element to just the philosophy behind this theory that transhumanism will make us godlike, right? I mean, it's essentially the Gnostic inversion of the garden story in Genesis, right? I mean, so the serpent has the fruit and offers it up to Eve, and Eve says, no, we can't do that because God says we'll die, and the serpent says, no, he knows that when you eat it, you'll be like him. Surely you shall not die, right? Meaning you'll be like him, meaning you will be your own God, right? And it is the fruit of the knowledge, right? Knowledge of good and evil, to be precise. But I mean, if you think about, the Apple symbol, right? The Macintosh symbol, right? I mean, the fruit with the bite taken out of it.
Right. That's what I mean.
It's come on now. I mean, you could very much had an apple without a bite taken out of it.
There's a lot of symbolism like that everywhere. I mean, you look at the Amazon; it's a semi-erect penis.
Yeah. Well, I mean, and I've written a series on
unsee them.
There's a Barbara Marx Hubbard article that I wrote, and I should be finished with the next one. I will be finished with it this month, but I'm hoping in the next week or so, honestly.
Yeah.
But she's her biography is called the Hunger of Eve, and it's got an apple on it with a bite taken out of it, with the universe inside of it. I mean, this is a common trope. This is a common theme. I mean, right. And she was very much, the article I wrote, she was very much a proponent of transhumanism and also sort of the new age Gnostic kind of form of spirituality. I mean, she's a perfect example of where the two come together. Not just that someone like Kurzweil, who says, right, that will be godlike, or Larry Page and Sergey Brin that say that they want Google to be the mind of God, or Yuval Noah Harari, who's Homo Deus, basically means God man or man God, or the religious names that they give various robots like Gertzel's Sophia, right, which is one of the Hanson AI robots. I mean, it's not just that they allude to or use these sort of spiritual religious symbols or rhetoric. It's that, like, if you look at someone like Hubbard, this is where the two movements like actually come together in a person, right?
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah, I mean, there's a lot of research, a lot of areas we could talk about in that realm, going back to Helena Blavatsky and the development of Isis Unveiled, which was one of the big books of the counterculture, and which was a major influence on the Nazi movement. She founded Theosophy, which is the official religion of the UN. The UN meditation room is run by the Theosophists. And it's kind of a merge between occult and science and Darwinism. And in the late 19th century, it's called Spiritism. And it's devoid of any semblance of moral and ethical content. In fact, that's seen as prejudice. And it's it's into evolving the species into a new man.
Yeah, I mean, where the sort of the overlap between the Darwinian concept of evolution and also basically the Hegelian concept of evolution, because it's actually Hegel that comes up with the concept, right? That history evolves, that reason evolves through the dialectic of, right, thesis and antithesis, meaning contradictory ideas in history, right? And then as those clash, they come together in a synthesis, in a new iteration. So Darwin is actually basically just sort of a biological Hegelian, right? I mean, Karl Marx was a materialist Hegelian. You can even look at Freud as a psychological Hegelian, right? I mean, you have the dialectic between the superego and the id, and then that synthesizes into the ego. But somebody like Barbara Marx Hubbard, she talks about this thing conscious evolution, and she basically says that that there is she takes it from Pierre Teilhard de Chardin. Okay, he was a Jesuit.
He had a Catholic priest. Yep.
Yes. and he was a Darwinian and a avowed eugenicist. Many quotes of him advocating eugenics and population control. Said some favorable things about the fascists in Germany and Italy, but he came up with this idea of the noosphere. It comes from the term nous, which is Anaximander, I believe, or Anaxagoras. I was getting mixed up. And the nous is basically the mind of God. And so Desjardins basically says it's the mind sphere of the universe, and that it is sort of an energetic layer that we have sort of absorbed and that is manifest through us, that our consciousness is the noosphere, basically manifesting itself in a way that the universe, which to him is basically God, can know itself. So what's the difference between that concept of noetic evolution or Darwinian evolution? It's basically just the difference between what are the units of determinism. So in Darwin would basically say it's the biological determinism, and with our understanding of genetics, we would say it's genetic determinism. Conscious evolution of the noosphere would just be vibrational or frequency-based determinism, right? Now, if you think about transhumanism, you're talking about using electronic computer devices to interface with the human being, to re-engineer the human being, not just to re-engineer it in terms of its structure physiologically, but also, right, its states of consciousness through various electrical, right, vibrations and frequencies that you could upload through a brain-computer interface. So in other words, it's basically just the difference between vibrational determinacy and biological determinism. But if you can reduce biology, right, and the chemical structure of the human physiology to basically electrical frequencies or to vibrations, I mean, we're not talking about different things here. It's just the difference in terms of do we have to use selective breeding, or can we just basically re-engineer the biology itself through electrical frequencies? But it's pretty much they come together, right, at the end of the road.
Well, we've really covered the map here. John, I want to just wrap it up by asking, I mean, are you feeling optimistic in the face of this sealing of the universe by the illuminated powers? Or do you think that they are, as Steve Bannon says on his show, is this the last gasp of an illegitimate regime?
Well, I mean, I have faith in God Almighty, so I know that He wins in the end. For me, the real question is, do we have to go through the worst of it before it's over, right? So do they fall under the weight of their own evil before or after greater suffering than we've already witnessed in the last couple of years? But I would say that inevitably they will lose. It's just, are they going to crumble everything around them in the process?
Right. I mean, what kind of pain? I mean, I feel that there are good signs also that we can, where every so often they overstep themselves and they're exposed. I mean, as I mentioned earlier, the Canadian truckers, they stood up. The work of James O'Keefe filming that executive over at Pfizer and getting him to talk about mutating a new virus so they could make more money. That, and also that they were aware of infertility problems with the virus, with the vaccine. That's an exposure that millions of people have seen, even though they're trying to censor it. So these are the sorts of things that I think can tip the apple cart, because ultimately the exposure to the light of day is what destroys what they do. And you and I, in our own way, in our own limited way in this world, are trying to do that, and other people are too. And I think that there is a growing movement. I do think that Trump unleashed something that's positive in the world, and that there is, a kind of a populist, nationalist, libertarian movement, because those are the principles that are best for human society. Those are the things that make us free. And that it's not easy to suppress it. I mean, I think they just stole an election in Brazil, but it was done in a way that it was so obvious that I think that there are just these two forces going out against each other. The forces of authoritarianism and the forces of freedom. I mean, I guess it's the same fight we've always had, I suppose. So anyway, John, how can people get your excellent book? Or do you want to direct anyone to websites where they can learn a little bit more about you and your work?
Yeah, you can get pretty much everything through my website. It's schoolworldorder.info. So there's a link to the book, which you can get from Trying Day. You can also get it on Amazon, but it's always better to go to Trying Day. And then there's links to all my social media there. Haven't been on the social medias much lately. Last year was very busy. Hopefully I'm going to be doing it a little bit more this year, but in general, I enjoy being on social media less than, so I don't know that I'll be out tweeting like I used to ever again, but yeah, I try to get around to it at least once a week or something.
No, it's nice to take a break from it. I'm still kind of hooked on it, but anyways, I want to thank you for joining me as always. John Klusak is the author of School World Order, the Technocratic Globalization of Corporatized Education, available at Trying Day Books, available at Amazon. John, have a great day. Thanks as always.